If you're not sure how to do that, you'll see an icon that looks like a video camera. If you just click on that, it will switch your camera off. Okay. So I'm going to make a start, everybody. I'd like to welcome you all to the webinar this evening. This is the second of 3 planned webinars on getting the community more involved in the air quality, air pollution debate. But I have already been asked to organise a couple of others. So watch this space, because there may be more. And if you did join our first event, which was on the 7th of December, you'll know what a lively debate we had then. If you didn't, the recording is available on the CPA YouTube channel. So maybe Caroline or Rosie could put the link to that in the chat, because it'd be quite interesting for people. And so we want to continue tonight on our non-polluting journey to take action to reduce the harmful effects of contaminants in our air. And we know that this is a really big issue nationwide, actually. So we're going to focus today on local measuring and monitoring of air pollution and how communities can get involved. Just before I introduce our very distinguished speakers, I'm just going to give a little bit of admin. Just to mention again, we are recording the session today. We'd like you to put any questions you have in the chat. If you don't have the chat button and you want to raise a question, please will you wait till the end of each speaker's session, and we will take a look if there's any specific questions about that presentation, and we will ask at that time if if participants who don't have the chat function want to raise a question. For those of you who didn't hear me say this several times earlier, could you please introduce yourselves in the chat if you've got it, because we won't have time to introduce all our guests today. Now we've got a very inspiring session planned for you. I'm delighted to welcome our 3 speakers. They're going to help us understand that we should be doing more, and why we should be doing more to monitor locally the air pollution in our areas. How can we do it? And what about next steps? How can we expand that monitoring to cover other aspects of risks in our areas? So we're very lucky to have Professor Stephen Peckham opening our webinar today. Stephen is the Professor of Health Policy at the University of Kent and the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine. He's supported community groups, parish councils and others on air quality assessment issues in relation to local plans, planning applications and planning inquiries. So right up our proverbial street, really, because we are the Community Planning Alliance. And I think I saw something come through in the chat from Richard Knox Johnson that he'd been working with you, Stephen, and you managed to secure the first win in terms of air pollution in a planning inquiry, which is great news. So we're also very fortunate to have Graham Turnbull with us today. Graham started Clean Air Sheffield in 2017 and began making his own air pollution sensors in 2018. Initially, he worked with the University of Sheffield and he established a network of those sensors right across the city, sometimes building them himself and sometimes through workshops where he taught other people how to make the sensors and how to understand the sources and effects of air pollution. And he's going to give us a very practical example today of equipment that we can use locally to measure air quality. And last but not least, you've probably heard about smart cities. Well, our final speaker, Mike Josephs, is working on the concept of the smart village. And this will inform the better management and improved sustainability for our localities. and I think there's some very exciting results coming through. Mike's going to talk about air quality in the rural setting, and he'll also share a little bit of info about the next steps his team are taking. So I think that'll be very interesting for us too. But that's not all. I've already asked you to put your questions in the chat. And we're joined today by air quality addict, and that is his description, I have to say, Peter Fleming. Peter's going to help us to respond to questions, both directly in the chat and during the Q&A session afterwards. Peter's set up an organisation called Ask About Air, and he'll put his contact details in the chat so you can connect with him afterwards if you've got any subsequent questions. The other speakers are going to do that too, so you'll be able to have their connections, if you like, if you need them later. But let's get started, because we all recognise air pollution is a threat to the health of both humans and wildlife. We know action is needed to introduce policies and measures that will reduce the harmful effects we're facing every day. But we need evidence to get those policies introduced. And who better to gather that evidence but our local communities? So with no further ado, let's hand over to Professor Peckham to set the context for today's session. So do you want to share your screen, Steve?
Thanks very much, Marge, and thanks very much for inviting me. So I'm just going to hopefully share the right one.
Yeah.
There we go. So I'm going to try and be quick because I know that time's pressing. So I want to talk about the air quality, health, the environment and planning, but in particular perhaps set the scene as to why we need to measure and monitor air quality, and perhaps what's wrong with the current system at the moment. So air quality and health, should we be worried? Well, I think the simple answer to that is yes, and I'm sure many of you know that already. But I think increasingly what we understand is that air quality affects us across the whole life course, and in fact is before we're born through to when we're elderly. And I think that's really important to understand, and also that the effects of air quality, particularly at pregnancy and children, are lifelong effects. They're not things that go away just because we get older or may move away. So these are really important things that we need to consider. And most importantly, what we need to understand is that variations in air quality are quite important. And I'll come back to why that's important in a minute. But we know from the evidence, for example, that just an increase over a day of 10 micrograms cubic meter of NO2 is associated with health and mortality. Back in 2002, there was a real short-term exposure in the summer to PM10, and it's thought that was led to an extra 6,500 deaths in the UK and some 6,500 hospital admissions just from that variation. And there's also been some studies that show that daily or even short-term variations in particulate matter, particularly particulate 2.5, can be mapped against hospital, people going into hospital. And then more recently, we've seen Stephen Holgate's analysis with the sad deaths of Ella in London, where he linked these variations in air quality causally to the admissions that Ella had to hospital for asthma and direct related to her tragic and early death. So I think the pattern here is that we need to understand how not just that air quality is bad for us, but actually the patterns and why air quality is bad for us. And I think in particular, one of the things I'd just like to highlight is the World Health Organization have recently lowered their limits, and they are significantly lower than the limits that exist currently in England. So they reduced the nitrogen dioxide limit from 40 as an annual mean down to 10. So that's slashing it by 25. And then gave a daily mean of 25. Now, I can tell you that even in my little town of Canterbury, we wouldn't even get anywhere near those kinds of levels. We might come in under the English level of 40, but we certainly don't meet WHO limits. And then for PM 2.5, they reduced the levels. In fact, they used to be 25, as they still are in England, down to 5 micrograms as an annual mean. And I suspect, apart from somewhere way up in the Orkneys, there is nowhere in the UK that actually is meeting that limit. And I think what we need to understand there is that these are not limits necessarily below which there are no harmful effects. We actually know by the time you get to 10 micrograms for children, we're already seeing damage done to children's lungs. And obviously for particulate, nobody has come up with a safe minimum level. So no particulate is the only safe level. So why have they reduced those limits? Well, partly it is that annual mean, but it's more importantly is the recognition that it's the variations that happen on a daily, even hourly, but certainly we can see patterns of air quality and we can measure health impacts in relation to those patterns. So it's really important. But I don't want us to think that we only see health through that. I think we should not forget the environment. We know that nitrogen deposition is a far more immediate problem than climate change. Nitrogen's been called the elephant in the room, nature conservation. I'm sure you love seeing all the roadways, which have got lots of nettles and cow parsley, and they're there because they're actually soaking up the nitrogen that's being deposited on the roads. So we're actually changing our landscape through what we might call dry deposition. But obviously into waterways, we have this increasing degradation of waterways, again from nitrogen. And I've just fought in Canterbury with others to stop a park and ride being built right on the edge of one of England's few chalk streams, because there would have just been this draining of nitrogen and other things from the park into the riverway. Nitrogen threatens biodiversity. We are fortunate in some ways that there are clear guidelines on the detriment under the habitats assessment, which is very good. But we should also be aware that environmental degradation has its impact on health, and the move to green and blue open space is a really important issue that's come up through COVID, and we recognise that this is important. But if we're actually damaging it through destroying biodiversity and green habitats, then it's a problem. And there might be good assessment on habitats, but actually when we get to actually assessing the health impact, this is where the thing starts to fall down, and how I want to move on and talk a little bit about next. So there is an air quality monitoring framework. There is a national automatic framework run by the government through the Department of Environment, Fisheries and Rural Affairs. And they measure across a number of sites throughout the country, but very limited. In fact, there are over 600 places which are registered with the department where there is a breach of the current, now this is the current English limits. I can't remember exactly what it is. It does change very slightly, but it's certainly in the region of 650 now, I think. But unfortunately, the Department of Environment doesn't really recognise about 620 of them. They recognise the ones measured through their automatic sensors, and they have recently, because we know the legal action taken against them, that 38 towns have been pushed into doing, and I mentioned of Manchester earlier, before many of you joined, into doing something active to address these. And we're now seeing the development of clean air zones and other measures to do that. But actually what's not happening is that the other 600 places, there is often no action. Certainly the government isn't taking any particular action. against local authorities to ask them to do something about the poor air quality in their area. So what is monitored and why is it monitored? Well, local authorities only monitor NO2 and PM10. So that's the two that they are legally required to, of the ones that we're particularly interested in. They do in some cases do limited 2.5. These are the very small particulates, usually on major roads is where these are measured. And very occasionally they might measure O3, which is the kind of low level oxide. Now, low level ozone, sorry, not oxide, ozone. Since I moved to Canterbury in 2012, every year Canterbury has breached the legal limits, including often the hourly limit for low level ozone. And nothing is ever reported, nothing is ever done about this. So we do have a problem about regulation. I think the other problem is that we mainly, and local authorities, I don't blame them, mainly measure nitrogen dioxide with only limited measurement of particulate and ozone. And they tend to measure this either in the areas that have already been designated as breaching the English limits, or along busy roads and some other areas which may be at particular risk of nitrogen deposition. They're measured mainly through something called a diffusion tube. Now, many of you will know what a diffusion tube is, but the diffusion tube is a chemical way of measuring air quality, and it gives you a monthly average reading, but it's pretty inaccurate. And it's averaged over the month. So all the data that we need to do things like daily differences in nitrogen dioxide that I mentioned earlier, we rarely have that data. Nobody's really measuring it, and nobody's measuring it in the places where probably it needs to be measured. We've got so little high quality measurement with hourly or real-time data. Now, why is that important? Well, I can point to, and like one of the later speakers, we've built small monitors which we've given to local people in the local community to monitor. And we've also put static, cheaper monitors up on lampposts, often not working with the local authority, I have to say. And in areas where the average annual level of NO2, it was well below the 40. In fact, in one place it was 27. So it's kind of nearly in the kind of lower half, but certainly well under 3/4. We were finding hourly rates of NO2 at 150 plus, all down mainly to static traffic and congestion. So the hours at which those rates at 150 and plus were recorded, in particular, one of the roads was between 8 and 9 in the morning, and then again between 3 and 5 in the evening, right next to a primary school. So we know that children are more exposed, and particularly if you have somebody in a pram, there's been some studies from Surrey University which show that infants in pushchairs and prams can actually absorb 50% higher levels than would be measured at the roadside. So the data that we get really from the current monitoring system is inaccurate. And I know we're going to hear about what Sheffield's been doing from community, but there are other authorities that have started to do different things, like Norwich, for example. And so it's an inadequate monitoring framework. More importantly, it's an inadequate regulatory framework. So I mentioned that the 600 areas where there is a major problem, but the government itself tends to put the responsibility to the local authority. But the local authority is only required to do a plan. There is no legal requirement for them to actually take action. And even when they don't take action, nobody actually takes any action from central government. The levels we have do not protect our health. You know, they're well above now what WHO considers to be not safe, but reasonable. And the DEFRA guidance directs us to look at specific areas. And unfortunately, what we do is we tend to measure outside of buildings or man-made structures, but we very rarely measure where large numbers of the public are regularly present, yet that's in the guidelines. Despite all this, we now have national air quality strategy objectives, and these are to achieve WHO guidelines, but that was the old guideline, not the new guideline. And unfortunately, when the government brought out its new environmental health bill, all of these kind of aims and objectives about reducing have been left out. There are no targets in the bill at all, or in the Act as it now is. So there's no legal limits set within the Environment Act which equate to the strategy objectives, apart from the fact that the Secretary of State is required to set air quality targets and will have to do so at some point in the future. Local authorities are only required to prepare a plan, not to demonstrate that they're meeting the plan or that DEFRA will take action. In fact, DEFRA outsources the monitoring of air quality management plans to a commercial company who actually just look to see if they're filled out correctly. So basically what we have is a very, very poor regulatory framework for air quality measurement within local communities. So what about planning? Well, air quality is actually quite important, particularly in the National Planning Policy Framework. And air quality development should, wherever possible, to improve local environmental conditions, such as air and water quality. That should take opportunities to improve air quality or mitigate the impacts. They should be identified. And the Institute of Air Quality Management Guidance for Planning Quality Assessment says the judgment on significance relates to the consequences of the impacts. Will they have an effect on human health that could be considered as significant? And they set out this table of when things are substantial and when things are negligible. Many of you, I'm sure, would have looked at these things. But these all now relate to the English level of 40 for NO2 and 25 for PM2.5. And we know that they are not anywhere near safe enough for human health. The other thing that the Institute says is that the assessment of human health should be undertaken by a qualified person to do so. Well, I have looked through loads of air quality assessments, and I've never seen a health professional asked to make a judgment about the impact of air quality on health. In fact, local planning authorities give less weight to air quality issues. A quote from a planning officer: "Air quality is a low priority." And that was building a block of flats where levels of nitrogen dioxide were going to be 56 plus. There was another quote from an air quality assessment which talks about air quality standards are long-term benchmarks for ambient pollutant concentrations which represent negligible or zero risk to health based on medical and scientific evidence. Well, not according to WHO. You know, we should have levels that are 25% of what an air quality assessment is currently using as something which represents negligible or zero risk to health. There is a complete disconnect between air quality assessment and health. So air quality is used as a proxy, but actually worse than that is that the current ambient limits are used as a proxy for health. Absolutely useless. There's another problem because those air quality assessments are often based on modelling. Now, diffusion tubes, I'm sure those of you that have been involved know that diffusion tubes are highly unreliable. And in fact, on the whole, they overestimate the levels of nitrogen dioxide. So universally, whenever you're using diffusion tubes, they are adjusted down to what's considered to be a proper level or the real level of air quality, of emissions of NO2. Well, we did an analysis of all the diffusion tubes which are linked to and next to a automatic modelling, and we found that between 25 and 30% of them were underestimating. So if they're underestimating and then they're reduced down, the whole kind of system is based on models which are based on poor data and therefore inaccurate. And often those models are reliant on traffic trip modeling. Now, I'm sure everybody who's been involved in planning applications knows that often traffic trip modeling is an art in its own right. So if the traffic trip modeling is wrong, and they base the air quality modeling on, which is also wrong, on poor traffic trip, the whole thing becomes a little bit of a farce when you're trying to actually get some accurate data. Yet, those are taken as fact by local planning authorities. The other thing that developers do is they redistribute pollution. They build another road, reduce the main road down below 40 and say, fine, we haven't got a problem. In the meantime, they built a road which increases the air pollution there to 25 or 30, but that's not sufficient to make it a significant increase. So again, they don't have to do mitigation. And then the other thing that developers are very good at doing general mitigation. And the one thing that we did manage to do in the Kent case was to change the air quality guidance to say that developers now have to demonstrate at least that there is mitigation. But actually, if they were really following the national planning policy framework, they should be actually ensuring that levels at least were neutral, which is actually found in some plans, such as the London plan, or they should be improving air quality. So better monitoring is necessary. We need to do that because road transport is the major source. And unfortunately, I don't think that electric cars are going to solve the problem for us, given that 21 to 33% of emissions come from non-exhaust sources. So we know that tyres, brakes, and all these things are likely to contribute to particulate, and therefore we need to be concerned about traffic per se levels, not just the fact that they have combustion engines. And we also need to know about patterns of pollution, where people live, work, and are regularly exposed to emissions. So we do need different ways of doing monitoring. What we need is localized real-time monitoring. We need to understand what happens when people are regularly passing by every day at 8 o'clock to 9 o'clock in the morning, children on their way to school. We know that if they walk up a busy road, it reduces their cognitive impairment that day. Well, what if they do it every day for week in, week out at the same time? What's that doing to their health? We need to monitor patterns of emissions. Local plans need stronger statements about air quality and health impacts. Planning committees should consider health more centrally, and that argument has to be made over and over again. And I think they should require health impact assessments as they do in some other countries. And planning committees should actually require mitigation strategies that are based on good evidence of impact, not planting more trees. In fact, they can plant more trees and actually make the problem worse. So they need to demonstrate that they are using evidence. A travel plan, we did an analysis of travel plans in Kent. Travel plans reduce travel by car by anything between 3 and 5%, whereas most developers would tell you that they do it between 20 and 25%, but it's not based on evidence. So that's an overview. There's some interesting kind of comments and information, which when I'll circulate these slides, these have all got links, so you can link straight through to the information directly. And I'll send these to Marge to be circulated. So thanks very much, and I hope that wasn't too quick.
It was really interesting. It was really interesting, Stephen. I'm sure everybody else thought so too. I suppose it would be quite easy to get a bit depressed, wouldn't it, about the the situation with the monitoring? But I think it just really demonstrates why it's so important that communities get involved.
Definitely.
Because, you know, obviously other people that should be doing this are not doing it today. or they're not doing it effectively. So did we have any questions that that relate specifically to Stephen's presentation? Anybody got any particular questions? I can see a couple of hands up. And if people do have the chat function, please can you put your questions in the chat? If you don't have the chat function, then you can put your hand up. Now, the only questions we're going to take now are questions that relate specifically to Stephen's presentation, not for general discussion. So I'm going to pick on the hands up people first, and then perhaps if we can just have a look through, Caroline, the questions in the chat. So Nick Unsworth, do you want to come off mute? And
yep, thank you. Thank you, Stephen, and very interesting. I'd like to add something else. I lead a campaign against an incinerator at this end in Essex, and you talk about the separation between the monitoring, the responsibility. I'd just also like to add the separation that we're coming across within this one between the Environment Agency and the planning. As soon as you start talking to the planning about air quality and et cetera, and pollution, they just bat it off onto the Environment Agency. And there is no connection between the two. In our particular case, we actually had to provide the Environment Agency with air quality monitoring and gas dispersion modelling that they hadn't done because it was done by the client. So there's a real separation at this level and industrial level as well that is even more worrying, because in this particular case, 600,000 tonnes of incineration in rural Essex has a huge impact. Thank you.
Yeah, no, I just agree with you. That's all I can say. One of my great friends in America has been fighting incinerators for something like 50 years. So I'm with you all the way down. Thank you.
Yeah, I'd like to follow up on this afterwards if I can with you a little bit. Thank you.
I think the other thing, guys, the Community Planning Alliance is running a survey at the moment on air pollution issues. And again, we'll put the link to that in the chat too. But please do take the time to complete that, even if you can't complete everything, because what it will help us with is to get a picture of the situation nationwide. And perhaps we can then start thinking about what the actions should be from both national groups like ours and also at a local level. Nick, if you'd like to just press the button again, it'll lower your hand, and I'm going to move on to Joanne. Do you want to come off mute, Joanne?
Hi, everybody. Thank you, Stephen. That was a really interesting presentation. I'm from Safe Ferriby, which is a village in the East Riding, and we're right along the A63. And our children have to walk along the A63 to get to their secondary school. It's a busy road, and we've been fighting an Amazon warehouse to be built right opposite the school, which will increase it massively. We have an air monitor in place. I'm a public health professional, but this isn't my area of work. And we get things like in NOx, we get over 100 sometimes. We get PM 2.5 of 40. We get PM of 20 at 58 when the children are walking to school. We find that it's unfortunate that when they're walking to school, it coincides with rush hour traffic. And the thought of an extra 200 plus HGVs going along that road and increasing that further, we can't get anyone to listen to us. It's so difficult to get anyone to hear what we're saying about the children. We've even got a local cardiologist who's written a medical report, but the council have passed it. So we're obviously trying to get a group together to see if we can get the school on board and try and do some work to raise it, you know, locally and fight it as much as we can. It's very difficult.
No, I sympathise, Joanne. I don't know if it was you who contacted me.
Yes, it was.
By email.
Yes,
yes.
it was.
Very nice to meet you. And,
nice to meet you too.
Yeah, I mean, you know, if there are things that we can do, by all means, you know, I'd be happy to help. But I explained our situation is a little bit complicated as well, at work. But we do lots of things like that, and it is very difficult. I think getting local authorities to really sit up and pay attention to this, it's difficult, because it's actually difficult getting a lot of health professionals to sit up and pay attention to this. So the answer is only that is in numbers, because that's the only thing that local authorities understand in terms of campaigning. But there are things that they could do to mitigate some of this, creating better safe walking ways, doing some separation of the pavements from the road would also, so there are things that they could do which would make it not brilliant, not perfect, but would actually mitigate some of the things. And that's the sort of thing Amazon should have been paying for.
Yeah, I don't think they've got them to pay for anything, so it's going to be totally inconvenient to everybody but Amazon.
Yeah.
So it's very difficult, and I'm just wondering, just really quickly as well, I'm sorry, I'm just asking another one. Do you know if the WHO levels are likely to be coming in around October? There's a talk, isn't there, about bringing the levels down and the new targets? Is there any ideas?
I got to say, I'm going to be gobsmacked if this government adopts WHO targets now they've been reduced.
Okay.
I may have to kind of come back and apologise for that, but I would be absolutely gobsmacked. Scotland reduced their level to 10, and they're struggling. We haven't even met our target that was set for years ago.
1985, wasn't it?
So God knows how they think they're going to do it. They can't. I would be happy if they even just did the reduction targets that were in the strategy. At least it would be a start. I don't think they're perfect, but I still can't see this particular government taking it seriously, listening to the Environment Committee. The lack of real awareness of what the problems are across the country by people in DEFRA, I think is absolutely astounding.
I think
really astounding.
I'm just going to interrupt, Stephen,
Sorry,
because I'm conscious of the time, and we've got another 2 presentations to go through. But I do think 2 things strike me, Joanne. One is sustainable freight transport, which it seems to me that organisations and councils take the easy way out and don't look. They're taking the quick and simple way, put everything on the road. So there is that sustainable freight that I think we should be campaigning for nationally. And I think the other thing, Stephen, is how we make it more visible, because I just don't think there is the visibility about the impact of the things that were in your presentation there. We really need to get out there into the public domain, more into everybody, into every school, into the newspapers, etc., because I just don't think it's visible enough. I'm conscious that there's a lot of other hands up. Can I just check with Caroline? Caroline, are there any specific questions in the chat that we need to pick up on for this presentation?
Peter Fleming had quite a lot of very detailed, specific questions. It may be easier for Stephen to have a quick look at those and answer them by chat rather than going into the final details. But there was a more general one, which was from David, asking about whether the Client Earth campaign has had any effect so far. I think that would be an interesting one for people to discuss.
Well, I mean, Client Earth got the 38 areas that the government has taken action in. So that's the cities that are currently required to not only produce a better plan, but to put it into some kind of action. What it hasn't done yet is really push DEFRA to start looking at areas that DEFRA don't recognise necessarily as having a problem, because their measurements don't show there being a major problem. The fact they've got 650 air quality action plans sitting in the offices telling them that there's widespread problems across the country, and to be true, there's more than 650. We did some monitoring in Faversham before they introduced their 20 mile an hour, which is a very small town of 10,000 people, which actually had levels above the 40 annual for nitrogen dioxide. So you could probably double the 650 or triple it, I would think, in this country to find out where the problem areas are. And those are still being ignored by the government. And even if they set new targets, who's going to enforce it? There's been no appetite from central government to enforce this. So so it's had an effect, but not a big effect.
Sued.
Yeah.
You know, I think it'll take somebody suing them and winning the case, and you know, to because it's usually money that turns things round, isn't it? Now, Luke, I see that you've put your hand down. We'll come back to you towards the end. Richard Knox-Johnson, do you have a question for Stephen, or is that a legacy hand?
No, it's not, and thank you very much for inviting me. Hello, Stephen. Nice to see you again.
Hi.
I just wanted to draw your attention to something which I think might work with air quality, and that is if we stopped some of the developments that are taking place in the country because of air quality reasons. And I'm quoting here from, I mean, when we got our victory, due to Stephen's input into that, it was challenged by Gladman in the High Court and then the Appeal Court, and both were turned down. And as a result of which, there was something there which in planning is now a precedent which could be used. And if I may, I'm going to quote this in full because I think it's important. Since the inspector's conclusion on the likely harmful effects on air quality in the air quality management areas and on human health, and his finding of conflict with government policy in paragraph 124 of the NPPF, rested on his conclusion that the effectiveness of the proposed mitigation was unproven, which plainly it did, there was no need for him to spell out the conclusion that Gladman's approach on mitigation was inconsistent with air quality plans. It was submitted by CPRE Kent. An essential purpose of the air quality action plans was to improve air quality in air quality management areas, which, as the air quality action plan for Newington made it quite clear, might require planning permission to be refused where effective mitigation could not be secured. Proposed developments such as this, judged likely to worsen air quality in a material way because of the proposed mitigation, had not been shown to be effective, was inevitably inconsistent with the air quality action plans. This too was obvious. The inspector's reasons were not deficient for his not having said it. And I think, you know, if more people want to use that as a precedent in this, I think then the government are more likely, more quickly to take some action which is desperately needed. And I do have the opportunity of saying public, if I may, that Stephen's contribution to that victory at that particular appeal was absolutely essential, and we owe him a great debt of gratitude for it.
Thank you. Is there a link that we can put in the chat, Richard, to that, so that people can have it?
I can certainly send you a link from the case number, and the date was the 12th of September 2019.
Right. Yeah. Okay. Super. Well, listen, do you want to put your hand down, Richard? So if you lower your hand, thank you. Stephen, do you want to stop sharing? Because we're going to move over to Graham now. And I think this is really pertinent, Graham, because we just heard how bad the air quality monitoring is that's done by local authorities and others. So please tell us what we can do to do something as a community. Do you want to start sharing your screen?
Yes, I'm doing it now. Does that look good?
Yep, it is.
Yeah, so that was an amazing presentation, Stephen. Thank you. And I'm still absorbing some of it myself coming into my own presentation, so I'm feeling a bit stunned. I'll just tell you a little bit about what I've been doing the past few years here in Sheffield, where I live. I got into this. I don't have to spend much time explaining why, basically because of all the things that Stephen was talking about, and the lack of monitoring, lack of awareness, lack of, you know, we're very lucky in Sheffield. We do have air quality monitoring. We have lots of diffusion tubes, which tell us, 3 months after the fact, whether we had pollution in January or not. We have some real-time monitoring of PM 2.5, but only in a few areas. So I wanted to know, what's the air like outside my house right now? What's the air like at my children's school playground right now? And I can do that for PM 2.5, and I do it in about 50 or 60 different locations right now. So the thing that I make is based on an open source project. One of we're lucky actually tonight I noticed one of the people from the project on the call actually. It's called Sensor.community, and they have a project called Airor, which means air pipe. It's a global project. There's more than 14,000 of these PM 2.5 monitors in 69 countries. Costs about £40, depends on where you buy them and how many you buy. I tend to buy them directly from China, so they're a lot cheaper. It's not for everyone, it's a little bit technical, but I went from not having made anything like this before, done anything quite like this, to having a couple up and running in a couple of weeks. And what I thought I would do is take what I learned and I would help other people to make these things so we could spread them out more, especially across Sheffield. This is what they look like. This is an old picture because I noticed I don't have any spider proofing on them in this picture, but this is the two that are sitting outside my house right now and have been for a few years. So this won't be for everyone, but I just want to give you a really quick overview of the kinds of things that are involved, because you might think, I could do that part, and I know someone who could help me with this part. I'm always available by email, at least if someone has a specific question, or I've given lots of advice to people across the country on how to do this. And sometimes I make them and sell them, or give them away depending on what the situation is. But basically, we're talking about getting some parts, and I'll show you the list of parts in a second. Flashing the firmware, so that means we have a little computer board. I don't know if you can see this, but I'll hold it up anyway. A little computer board which has to have some software put on it, and the software comes from the project in Germany. You make the electrical connections, you physically secure the parts together, you configure them, connect them to your home Wi-Fi or school Wi-Fi or public Wi-Fi. You register them online with the Sensor.community platform, and then you put them inside an enclosure. And the traditional enclosure to use are these German plumbing pipes that you'll see in the picture. But it could be any enclosure, and some people make their own or they 3D print them. And then you put it outside and you plug it in. They don't use much power. They don't use much of your Wi-Fi, but they need to be continuously connected because they're reading every 145 seconds. So these are the parts. I stole these images from the Sensor.community website, and I better say that since one of them is on the call, and added some of my own. But you can see the kind of things that you need. You have the electronic components, like this is the actual, can you see my mouse, I hope? This is the actual optical sensor where the air goes in here, and there's a little fan and it actually measures the particles. This is the little computer board with the Wi-Fi on it. This is a humidity, temperature, and pressure sensor, which you can optionally use. I won't really get into the reason for that right now. There's DuPont cables you can use to connect them together. I use something called JST. They just fit a little better. Japan solderless terminals. You need a USB cable. And I said already you need an enclosure, a little piece of air tubing, and some mesh to protect from insects and spiders. And you can get these parts on eBay or Amazon. I get them on AliExpress, so I'm ordering them directly from China. And it takes longer. It's a bit more of a hassle. Probably works better if you're buying to make more than one. And you can get them certainly for cheaper. So the Sensor Community, on the Sensor Community website, and it's just sensor.community if you want to check that out and learn more about it, there's a tool called a flashing tool. And basically what this allows you to do is, this is software you run on any computer. You can download whatever version you need. You connect the little computer board. It's called an ESP8266. You connect this with a USB cable, a short USB cable, to your computer. You install the flashing software. You press a couple of buttons, and it puts the software on the board that you need in order to make this work. I won't go through all the details right now. Then you have to make some electrical connections. If you use the weather sensor over here, this is for humidity, temperature, and barometric pressure, which makes the whole thing more interesting. Then you're talking about 8 wires, essentially. 4 wires for the optical sensor, and then 4 more wires for the weather sensor. You can use DuPont or JST cables, as I said before. The whole thing is powered by a USB cable, which is attached here. When it's put together, it looks like this. So you can see that we've connected both the sensors to the board. You connect the USB cable to the board, and the air inlet tube goes on. And then you can secure the parts together with little cable ties or something, just so that you're not dependent on the electrical connections to hold it together. So then the next step is to connect these things to your Wi-Fi. So they're very clever, these boards. What they do is when they're first powered up is they broadcast their own little Wi-Fi network. And you can detect this easily on your phone when the first time you plug it in and after you've flashed it with the firmware using the firmware flashing tool. So they produce this little Wi-Fi network called Recor, and then you have this number here, which is the unique identifier of this device. When you click on that, if you're using an iPhone, for instance, the window will just pop up, which allows you to connect it to your own Wi-Fi. So in my case, my Wi-Fi is called YYZ. I click on that, I put my Wi-Fi password in, I click Save Configuration and Restart. And when the thing restarts, it takes about 10 seconds or so, it will join my home Wi-Fi network. And then I can interact with it over my Wi-Fi network or my LAN. So you have to configure it. Basically, configuration means you tick a box for each sensor using. The default is this particulate matter sensor and this humidity, temperature, weather sensor. And you might want to bookmark that, obviously. And then once you've done that, it takes about 145 seconds to make the first reading. But if you click on current data, you can see the last set of readings that were taken. And those can be updated every 145 seconds by default. So once you know that the thing is working, there's a lot of noise, sorry. I think someone's not on mute anymore. Once you know that the whole thing is working, the next step is to register it with the sensor.community platform. And that's very easy. You go to their website at devices.sensor.community. If you don't have an account, you register by putting in your email address and a password. You get a link by email, you click on it, and then you're able to register your own devices. So you'll click on a button that says, I want to register a new device, and you have this page at the right-hand side. It looks a bit complicated, but really what you're doing is putting the unique sensor ID in the box, giving it a name that's useful for you, especially if you make 100 of these like I have. The address of where it is at that address, how high above the ground is it, where is it relative to traffic. You select, again, the sensors you're using, so it's SDS 011. You change the sensor type to whatever weather sensor you're using. And then there's a really cool button here, a function that says look up entered address. So you put in your address above with your postcode and your town and everything. When you look up entered address, it actually drills down on a world map, and you can choose exactly where to display your sensor on the international project map. So once you have registered it and you know that it's working, it's time to put it outside. And before you do that, you have to protect it from the weather and from the insects and things like that. So like I mentioned before, you can use these German plumbing pipes. They used to be very easy to order them from Germany. It's a little bit more difficult now. Very recently, I used Amazon.de, and they came in about 5 days. Obviously, it costs a bit more than it used to get these things. But basically, you slide the sensors inside, you put the other half of the tubing on, and you cut the air inlet so that it's not sticking out. You can see the little weather sensor there at the end. And like I said, I would recommend putting mesh around these, because I made 50 or 60 of these. And the first summer, I lost half of them because spiders really like living in small air tubes, it seems. So once this thing's up and running, and I realize I've covered a lot and you're all saturated, but once it's up and running, you have a lot of different ways you can access the information. So you can browse to the device on your own network and get the latest set of readings. There's a color-coded map I showed you at the beginning. I'll show you again in a second, which shows all of the sensors in the world on one map, which is very cool, because then you can compare the air quality outside your house to someone's house in Berlin or in Kent or wherever you're interested in looking. And there's also a URL or a web address that you can type in. For every sensor, you can see the historical data. So you can see what's my air been like over the last 24 hours, over the last 7 days, over the last 4 weeks, over the last year. This is one outside my house. It's been going for a few years. And even what the moving 24-hour average is. And this device is good for PM 2.5. It will give you data for PM 10 as well, but I don't really use that. You can also use APIs if you're a programmer. I know I've done projects where I've actually accessed the data using using some other equipment in my house. So, you know, my HomePod, Apple HomePod Mini is actually connected to these sensors. It's a long story for another time, but I can actually make lights in my house change color based on pollution levels. And you can send the data to your own database, which I do because I have lots of these, and then I can compare different neighborhoods in Sheffield. So if I see something a little bit strange going on, I can investigate it. I can ask around, or I can find out, you know, what was going on in Greystones tonight, that kind of thing, and build a better understanding of what's going on. So this is the map. This is showing most of these sensors are mine. Some of them, if you drill down on the map, you'll see that these green hexagons are actually more than one sensor in that area. The map allows you to zoom in and out. So it's about £40 to make one of these. You can order the parts or kits. Sometimes I ship them out. You know, let me know if you have a particular requirement, especially for the pipes, which I usually order in bulk. And I'm happy to support anyone who wants to participate in this project, because I think it's really useful if we have a bigger part of the UK covered.
Well, that was a whistle-stop tour, Graham, and for everybody watching, of course, you'll be able to watch it in smaller chunks when you're watching the recording playback. But Richard, what's your Graham, what's your experience been of other people being able to pick this up quickly and be able to make their own? Because I guess it depends. Would people feel it's a bit technical? And
so when I've done this sometimes with groups of people. Once we did it with 16 people at Sheffield, gave us a lecture room, and we went in there and we made a lot of these together. There are some steps that when I've made them with other people that I still do. So for instance, I will flash the firmware onto the little device, and then people just have to kind of connect them up, and we show them how to do that. And then we show, you know, we help them register them on the platform and things. But there, you know, I sometimes look at my map of Sheffield. You know, I look at the map and I zoom in on a Sheffield, and I see these little colored hexagons where I think I had nothing to do with that sensor going there. I had nothing to do with that sensor being built. And sometimes they use different sensors, and that might cause a bit of a problem. But there are lots of people. There are lots of people, you probably know some yourself, who can definitely help you do this. The instructions on sensor.community are excellent. And if you get stuck, there's always people to help.
Super. Okay. And I mean, I think that, you know, a lot of people will be interested in talking further about this. Graham, will you put your contact details in the chat? I know they're on your slides, but if you could put them in the chat. And I think has anybody got any specific questions about Graham's presentation? David, did you want to raise something?
Hi, thank you. That's can everybody hear me? Can Graham hear me?
Yeah, hi, David.
Thank you. Thank you. Really interesting, and I'd like to have a go myself. I'm not an expert, but I did electronics at school. A couple of very quick questions. How are they calibrated initially? Are they just calibrated at the factory, or is there any calibration involved? Or is it best to buy two and sort of take average readings?
Yes, you're a mind reader. Yeah, they're very low cost devices. So the particle sensor itself, if you order them from China, you get them for less than £15. So this is, you know, it's not meant to be confused with the kind of thing your council or DEFRA might use, which might cost £20,000 or £30,000. The the data readings from them are incredibly close. I've been really impressed by how close they read. We have actually one that's co-located with a council monitoring station here in Sheffield. And yeah, actually having 3 is a really great idea. You do the same thing with NO2 diffusion tubes, really, because if you don't have 3, you have no way of knowing if your reading is a reflection of what's going on in the environment or it's just a problem with the device. I make them usually 10 at a time, and I tend to put them outside my house for a few days and make sure that they're all kind of reading what I would expect, against devices that I've been using for a while. But I try to have at least 3 in each ward of Sheffield that I'm monitoring in. And just, it gives you the confidence, when I have 2 at my allotment and they're showing exactly the same number right now. So it gives me some confidence that it's working.
Excellent, thank you. And just another brief question about the housing itself. It looks to me like a 4-inch soil pipe. How critical is the sort of housing diameter and so on?
It's closer to 3. It's closer to 3 inches actually. And the nice thing about the German sizes fit the particulate sensor is 72 millimeters square, and these pipes are 75 millimeter diameter, so it's a very snug fit, and it works very well. Also, you want the sensor to be placed kind of horizontally as well, so it kind of sits at the top of the joint in the pipes. It's very weatherproof. You can buy 75 millimeter elbows in the UK. Tend to have them for people with pond pumps and filters and things like that, and they're 10 times as expensive though as getting them from Germany.
Okay, that's great. Thanks for answering those questions.
No problem.
Okay, do you want to put your hand down, David? And Nick, did you have a question?
Yeah, sorry, finding the microphone. Yeah, it's just a quick one. Some of the areas we're looking to do are something similar. I'm really interested in this because we were going to go down the route with Airlie. And so questions in 2 parts. First of all, we've got quite remote areas where we haven't got power. Have you got any plans or ideas for putting them on solar and perhaps with a GSM module? Is the first part. And the second part. Sorry?
Graham, sorry, could I just interrupt there? Can we wait till we've heard Mike's presentation before we talk about that? Because Mike, I think you're going to talk about air quality measuring in the rural setting. So perhaps we can come back to that question, Nick.
Okay. And the other part was what about actions and what do you do with the data? Does anybody, does anybody believe you? Do you actually get anything, any sort of results from it, or people go, oh, holy crap, that's bad?
It's a huge public information awareness campaign, and the people who participate in the project are really also the subjects of the experiment, because the number of people who contact me about getting these things outside their house because they're concerned about air quality, then you go there and they have a wood burner and they have a big pile of logs or a chimenea or whatever, and it happens almost every time. And so you end up having, if I've made 100 of these things, I've had 100 really good conversations with people about air quality. And schools interested in air quality. I've definitely used the fact that I'm monitoring air quality to successfully campaign for school streets in Sheffield, which we've started introducing. I'm working with the council right now to monitor air quality at allotment sites because they're considering whether there should be an all-year ban, because we have a lot of allotments in Sheffield and they're right up against people's houses. I've got, so it's really raised a lot of awareness. I know, scientifically, it doesn't produce the kind of data that DEFRA is going to pay any attention to. I don't think DEFRA really pays that much attention to PM 2.5 anyway, but it has raised a lot of awareness, and lots of people have told me about behavior changes they've made as a result of having one of these sensors or hearing me talk about them.
Okay, thanks a lot. I'll put my hand up later on the next part if that's okay.
Super, yeah. Lucas, you are from the sensor community. Do you want to say a few words?
Yeah, hello everyone. Thank you so much for this gathering. Very interesting. I send my greetings from Germany. I coincidentally signed up, and then I wanted to ask the prior presenter, as he was speaking about local measurement networks, if he is aware of sensor community. And then I saw in the list that Graham will present, which is super amazing. I thank you so much. And I can add only a couple of answers to this questions prior to that. So We have 14,000 of the stations. They are hanging in 70 different countries, and a step-by-step guide how to put them together are available in 24 languages recently. So now we really have a global uptake. I am the international contact point, and I had hundreds of calls from all around the world. And you can believe me, from California with the wildfires, Australia wildfires, Kazakhstan wildfires, Greece wildfires. I have them all.
Yeah,
And
I think
only
Mike
one more
is going
thing.
to talk about some wildfires too. So, okay, Lucas, really.
One more thing, where the data is used, the RIVM, the National Health and Environmental Ministry, has dedicated an own data portal where all historical data, everything ever measured, they have fully integrated. They are also working with our API, so what comes into our network goes directly into their servers. They are working with our data on a national level, where they merge the data with the reference national stations. And the other part is that they take this data and go to the Joint Research Center Fairmont Group, working group number 6, where they do this on a European scale and merge citizen-generated data from Zenza community with the reference station, just to answer you if this data is taken seriously. Thank you.
Super, super.
Thanks,
Thank you,
Lucas.
Lucas. And Peter, I know you want to ask something, but just before we come to you, Caroline, were there any questions in the chat?
Actually, it picks up exactly what Lucas was just saying. There were a couple of questions saying that they've been told by local environmental health officers that they don't recognise data from the sort of citizen science monitors, but an answer saying Bristol has. So I think it probably is just a general point about how far down the line are we about this being accepted across the country, and what can we all do to make it more acceptable?
It's an interesting one, isn't it? Because I really like the idea of citizen science, and I think some citizen science is really accepted. So I think one of the actions we need to think about is, how do we get the same acceptability in citizen science for air quality monitoring? And perhaps that's something we can pick up in the general discussion at the end. But Lucas, did you want to just jump back in, or was that your legacy hand there? It might be a legacy hand. Peter, did you want to ask a question? Oh, you're on mute at the minute.
Yeah, Graham, obviously we've spoken. The real question is, would you feel comfortable with someone trying to contest data from a local reference monitoring station using one of your devices?
I can't get your question, Peter. Sorry.
I think what you said was, would you feel comfortable if somebody was contesting the data? So, if we were going to a planning inquiry or something like that, would you feel that the data would stand up to a test? And I think what we've got to recognise here is that a lot of air quality monitoring, and Graham, correct me, and Stephen too, and Mike, is indicators of air quality. It's not absolutes. So basically, if you have a situation most of the time where your PM2.5s are sitting at 6, let's say, and then at certain times, because of traffic or somebody with a wood burning stove or something like that, it goes up to 25 or 40 or whatever it goes up to. It gives you an indicator of what's happening to air quality at that point in time. It's not an absolute. And I think, we need to get our heads around the difference between absolute data and indicators of circumstances, whatever that might be. Did you agree, Graham?
Yes, sir. I think I get the point that you're trying to make. I don't have it handy, but I did have, whenever there's like an air pollution episode in Sheffield, what I do is I collect the local data that's available from the official sources, and I find my sensors which are nearby, and I usually put a graph up on Twitter or something, which shows the correlation is amazing. It's really amazing for something that costs so little. I mean, I talked to all kinds of people interested in air quality, all kinds of community groups. No, not one of them could afford anything, any alternative to sensor community. You know, they're talking about Airly, £1,000, or, you know, Earth Sense or whatever. You know, these things cost thousands of pounds. And if you're like you and your 5 neighbors trying to like understand what's going on in the air in your community, it's just out of your price range. It's just not going to happen. So, you know, I've heard all these kinds of objections and things like that, you know, but, you know, this is really about raising awareness. And maybe if a few thousand people in Sheffield see that there's some, you know, orange hexagons on the map tonight instead of green, maybe they'll ask why it is. And maybe some of them will not light their wood burner and make the situation worse. We do have a project that has just launched in the last week or so, where they take the University of Sheffield and the University of Nottingham, they take my data. They have a website which shows in very clear graphical way what the air pollution is in Sheffield neighborhoods where we have monitoring. And it basically says, don't light your wood burner, or, you know, if you're going to light your wood burner, light it. It's not so bad right now. But they've actually produced a system, like a traffic light system, that says it's really bad out there right now. Don't make it worse. And we're hoping that gains some traction over time. And so if you're making a traffic light system, you know, where it's like red, or, you know, green is good and yellow is not so good, red is bad, purple is terrible, I think people can relate to that. And whether that's off by 10% or so, it doesn't matter.
No.
And it's not like nitrogen dioxide, where you have a legal limit of 40 annual average over a year. It's not like that. You know, there is a limit of 25 for PM 2.5. So the average can be up to 25 for the annual average. Sorry, I keep repeating myself. So 25 is that kind of limit we're living with in the UK right now. I can tell you, probably most places in the UK don't even reach 25 as an average. In Sheffield, we reach about 10 as an average. So we're not even there in terms of you bring your data. Well, your data is going to tell you, any data you collect as a citizen scientist is going to tell you two things. Hold on, I'm going to fix something here. It's going to tell you two things. One, it's above World Health Organization standards, because everywhere in this country is above right now. The other thing it's going to tell you, it's below the UK national standard for air quality. That doesn't matter where you are in the country, that's going to be the case. We're so, you know, our official limits are so disconnected from prevailing public health wisdom.
Yeah, I think that's true. Okay, listen, I know there's a couple of hands up, but I want to move over to Mike now. And Nick, we'll bring you back in after Mike's session. So Mike, do you want to share your screen, and let's have a listen to what happens in the rural area, because that's a little bit more of a challenge, I guess, Mike.
Yeah, can you hear me?
You can. Yeah,
So,
and your presentation's coming through.
Good. Has it popped up on the screen? Hopefully it has. And is it on full screen? I think I've got it all correct.
I think you have, yeah.
Okay,
yeah.
First time. So thanks very much for the opportunity. It's been very interesting. So this presentation it's sort of almost an extension of a lot of what Graham has covered, because I live about 15 miles away from Sheffield in the Peak District, which is a very rural area by design. And it has very interesting demographic, and it actually has, you know, these hotspots of population, and then great areas of openness and sort of rural isolation. And the early work that Graham was doing, and I think through some of the contexts that we both had at Sheffield University, were the introduction I had to the idea of being able to monitor air quality pretty much for a very, very low budget, and do something which I think it has an impact when you can see things on the screen, and you can see locations, and you can see traffic signals, for example, and graphs. I think it's very, very powerful. It's a whole different story than if, you know, maybe you were sending reports to people or something. So I really thought that was very powerful. So Graham actually was a great help for this project. I just want to call that out right away. So about 2 years ago, following up on some of the activities we'd learned about in Sheffield, I contacted the Peak Park about doing an air quality network in the Hope Valley. And the Peak Park were actually quite receptive to the idea. I thought they wouldn't really take to it, but they actually put money up. And as a result, we built our own small network. Each of the dots you can see on the screen there is mostly 2 sensors in each location. And I put 2, just as Graham points out, because it's a good way to cross-check that you're getting a sort of a reasonably consistent indicator at any time. So we've had these up for, well, I think by March it'll be 2 years now. They were very easy to assemble. There's a couple of steps there. Graham, explained it very well. The more tricky thing we had obviously was to build a network of individuals willing to host them who had the right conditions. So that was, do you have a Wi-Fi network that's accessible outside the house? Do you have power near a window where we can hang a sensor? And are you in a place that it sort of makes sense to monitor? And we've tried to put these into the villages because clearly that's where we're going to have things that are measurable. And also then, as somebody raising a question earlier asked, what happens when you've got no power available? Can you run them off solar? You could, I think. You'd need quite a big solar panel because the sensor draws a fair amount of power when it runs. You could do it. But the question, I think, might be, there's so many more interesting places than out on the moors to put these things. I'm not quite sure. I guess you might have a situation where you're in an urban area, but you've no access to power. And I've been talking to a neighbor down the road here about getting a connection with the county council, who might give us access to street furniture, so we could actually get power from those to run things like this. But that's a different story. So I'll just follow through here. That's all a bit of a general preamble. So what happens in the Peak Park? So we've got our sensors on people's houses. As Graham points out, log burners, man, they're a disaster. They really are a disaster. The amount of emissions that they produce. So we have great air in the Peak Park almost all the time, except on those nights when people fire up their burners. And as long as the burner smoke doesn't go anywhere near the sensor, you kind of won't know. But every now and again, the sensors all go red because the wind has changed or something. And it's log burners. So that's been kind of interesting. We've learned about that. We worked in conjunction with the Hope Valley Climate Action Group, actually, to develop that network of people, by the way. And that turned out to be quite a good synergy. So that's our local climate action group. So if you've got one, you might be interested in connecting with them to help make it work. So here's a really interesting thing that has actually started to become more of a significant component in this, and it's that we do have good air, except the log burning time, and when they burn the moors. And as you know, moor burning has been going on in this country for probably centuries, and we have a lot of it in the Peak District. And it's because the estate owners are burning the moors in preparation for grouse shooting, and they create a huge plume of toxic smoke when they do this. And mostly, I've noticed, because I'm much more sensitive to this now, I notice when they're doing it that they do it when the wind is blowing away from the population centers. I've noticed this is quite interesting. But occasionally it doesn't work and the wind changes direction. So there's an example here where we had a big burn in 2021 on several different parts of the Hope Valley extremes. And we had a plume here showing on Shatton Edge, and there was another plume over on Lady Bower. I was aware of them just because I was out for a walk that day, and then I checked with the wind, and I could see actually that the wind was blowing all of the Lady Bower smoke over towards the Hope Valley. So that was quite an interesting correlation, because then the next step was to take a look at the sensor data for that day. And would you look at that? So that's 3 locations, PM 2.5, PM 10. And we've basically gone almost off the charts with those numbers compared to what we normally have. So what's been interesting about that is even in rural locations, we get these events. And these are, these are significant because that smoke blows into a village and it just hangs around. And as you can see from the length of time, I mean, this was a good part of a day that the air quality had fallen well below what the average was. And yet we have villages full of people who've retired to the Hope Valley, assuming that they've got no cause to worry about air quality. So in a way, they're right. Most of the time they don't. But in fact, there are occasions when this happens. There was a discussion a few moments ago about the nature of the data and its veracity in the face of, is it contestable? And I think the point made was a good one, that this is qualitative data. It's not quantitative. And I'd be the last person to even begin to say that the quantities are something such that you could, line them up against a $10,000 sensor and say it's a good match. But the qualitative value here is immeasurable, because you can look at that and say, well, gosh, things got bad, didn't they? And that's enough to galvanize people to action. So yeah, that's really what this is about. And I think, yeah, that's my 10 cents on that. Following up from the network of air quality sensors, a lot of people who were aware of the network through various communications and so forth began to reach out about developing a broader range of things that we might start to collect data on. And I did a bit of research, and it turns out there's quite a lot of things actually we could start collecting. And it's more in line with the kind of program than you've seen in cities over the last couple of decades, where there are sensors out there telling you what's going on in the cities. If you think of a very obvious one, it's things like the flow of people in and out of locations. This has been a huge issue for the Hope Valley region, because during all the various lockdowns and so forth, and then the release of restrictions with the ban on flying, we saw really, random surges in activity and visitor numbers into the valley, and there was quite a significant change in the quality of the landscape and the impact on the landscape, I should say, because of it. And quite a lot of the councils began to feel that they were just subject to this. They had no way of measuring it. And truly, there are no mechanisms. You don't know. You really no idea. How many visitors do you get every day? Well, we could guess. How many cars go down that road? Don't know. There's no data on it. And I'd be the last one to say that I know what to do with the data, but I'd be the first to put my hand up and say, well, let's try and gather the data. So we've now started to think about a broader set of things that might be valuable in the context of a smart village. So here are some of the the basics that we're looking at. So the volume of traffic, I mean, that's a really important one. There's an initiative that the Climate Action Group have now to see if they can't produce something like a plan for a transport hub in the Hope Valley, so that maybe people won't be driving into the Hope Valley constantly, and there's a more connected rail service or bus service and what have you. And then, some of these other points, it's not just about transport, pollution from transport, and there's just the obvious stuff, the use of footpaths, potential routes, trails, bridleways. We don't have any data. We don't know how many people traverse these things. We don't really have programs and policies that manage these, given those numbers. And in any one day, you don't know what the activity will be. And we don't know what drives it. So because there's all those questions, we're now looking at a broader range of data that we might begin to collect to try and answer the questions. Don't have a huge amount to report on that currently, but it is an ongoing initiative. Okay, that's pretty much all I have to share, and I think you've already seen a lot of that from on the air quality side from Graham, but I'm happy to take any questions or have anybody contact me.
Yeah, and I think Mike, what is interesting is how people in that rural setting are able to do that monitoring, you know, the battery operated, etc. So we have got a couple of hands up, so let's just we've got Pete with his hand up. Do you want to jump in, Pete?
Yeah, thank you. It's very interesting to see you focus on agriculture, because we know that the ammonium, ammonia from agriculture mixes with nitrous oxides from fertilizers. That also produces PM 2.5. It might be quite an interesting study for you to look into the reactions that happen with ammonia, ammonium sulfate, ammonium nitrates with NOx from traffic. So to see the difference in the kind of PM you get around roads near agriculture versus roads not near agriculture, because that might lead to quite different results. So that might be quite interesting to investigate.
Yeah.
There's also a study in Birmingham which looked at the agricultural impacts of pollution episodes, and that was around 46% of the pollution episodes also had a high ammonium sulfate content in the air, which indicates it was an agricultural source, and then that was in a city. Agricultural pollution can spread thousands of miles, but yeah, I've taken a note of your email address.
We did talk about that actually a little bit at the last one, Pete. Professor Harrison did pick that up as a big issue. So yeah, I think it is something worth exploring in a bit more detail.
Yeah, we have secondary aerosols and primary pollution, right? Primaries with the wood burners and so on. The secondary is the chemistry.
Yeah.
You know, what happens between gases and molecules.
Yeah. Very interesting. Okay, thank you. Caroline, did you want to jump in there?
Yeah, I actually had a question of my own rather than other people's, and it was for Mike, really. You've obviously been working with the National Park Authority, and I live in the South Downs. I just wondered if you knew whether the Peak Park Authority had been in touch with any other national park authorities, because they are very keen on the kind of natural capital aspects, and I just wondered if this is an important part of it.
I'm not sure they're as joined up as you might think they should be. Yeah, I'll just my insight on this is that actually certainly the Peak Park Authority, they are struggling the last couple of years with things like budget cuts and so forth. So I'm not sure how far abroad they've looked to develop these ideas. They've been very helpful and supportive in some of the projects that we've launched here. But yeah, sometimes we struggle to get up the tree inside the Peak Park because they're actually quite distracted by these bigger issues that relate to what their future is and what they're going to be doing. But it would be nice to know that they were talking. There probably is some sort of a regional park authority initiative. I don't really know what it is, though.
Maybe worth us following that up, Caroline, I guess. Okay, Stuart has a question as well.
Actually, more from Mike. There is a sensor called TELRAM, which is very similar to the it's proving extremely effective for us. We're putting it alongside real-time NO2 counters, and that's actually beginning to generate some fascinating information. Very early days. I can sort of vouch for the TELRAMs in terms of their accuracy, because the one that I put a link on in the chat is one outside my house, and the only thing that's done more than 70 kilometers an hour down the road was my lurcher trying to catch the neighbour's cat.
And where are you based, Stuart?
In Bristol. We're building a network of sensors, much like Graham. We're doing the same thing. We're banging out a whole load of sensors over a very small area, with some larger sensors in there to try and get a very granular picture of just one part of the city, which happens to be an area of high deprivation. And the one thing that we've known for the last 5 years, because we've been looking at PM 2.5, is the real problem we have is wood burners. The amount of PM 2.5 from traffic is almost unreadable, but the amount from the wood burners is just horrendous. We broke the WHO new limits for 24-hour average. They say only 3 to 4 days at over 15, and we did that 6 days on the trot earlier in this month.
Wow. Okay.
Do the TELRAMs, do they record speed as well? Yeah.
Oh yeah, if you follow the link that you've got, you'll see it splits. It uses artificial intelligence, and it splits between pedestrians, bikes, cars, and lorries. It gives you speed, it gives direction of travel, it gives you averages. Its one problem is it only works during daylight. It won't work under electric light, but in all other respects, it's you plug them together in exactly the same way as you do with the sensor community ones. And believe me, I'm a social scientist. I've got clumsy fingers. Even I can get them to work.
That's very interesting. Thank you. Thank you very much.
I feel a sort of little paper coming along, talking about the differences between these different sensors and the synergies as well, because there's clearly a lot of synergies between them too. Peter, you had a question. You're on mute, Peter.
Right, that's better. It's actually to answer a question about ammonium nitrate that came up from Pete. I know it's a couple of questions ago. Ammonium nitrate is formed when traffic pollution meets agricultural pollution. So what tends to happen is you get a lot more of it. It tends to take a while to form. So if you're measuring, you don't necessarily get it close to farming, but you do tend to get it higher in rural areas. The other thing is there's a question as to whether what it is that's in particulate is actually harmful. And there's a question of whether ammonium nitrate, it's not nice, but there's other much nastier things in particulate which we should probably be a bit more concerned about.
Okay, so that's useful to
values up. It doesn't necessarily mean it is bad. Okay.
Okay, super. Thank you. That's a useful clarification. Lucas, did you want to come back in? Lucas from the sensor community. Hey.
Yeah, just so I shared my contact details in the chat, so it would be really interesting if I could get in touch with all of you. It was interesting insights, and only want to let you know that technology-wise, there is no thing that has to be reinvented or changed. I mean, we have everything to really put it in place and to generate interesting data. What we are really lacking is coordination on scale. So what we do, we really like set up on a global scale. And I also shared the link where we've been invited to present the solution in front of like United Nations, WHO, European Commission, Joint Research Center. And we see really like a lack of like knowledge exchange. That's what it's lacking about. And we do not need to reinvent the wheel. We need really to scale up what works and coordinate our actions to really like have all the same insights, because technology-wise it's solved. We need more collaboration. Thank you.
Yeah, super. Thank you. Nick, I know you wanted to come back in.
Thank you very much.
Now.
Just very quickly, and I apologise because it is from my perspective, and that is the incinerator that's being built here.
Yeah,
just to put it into perspective very quickly, we have an incinerator being built. It is being objected to by all the parish councils around it. And we are quite well funded, which is probably quite unusual. We've been looking at the yearly monitor, but I'm really keen to see this community thing and how it is. But what I wanted to do is say we've got round how to get our data into the EA. What we've actually done is we are proposing to put sensors in one form or another based on tonight at all the same sensitive receptor places, positions that the used to do the modelling to model sulfur dioxide, NOx, small particles, everything that comes out of the incinerator. But what we've done is we've gone to the Environment Agency and we've said, what would it take to make our data be acceptable to you? And they've given us their monitoring standards. So they're SEMS and MEMS. And if we monitor those standards and can differentiate between the emissions and the impact, because the operator's got to monitor his own emissions and then calculate his impact, they've said they will support our data and they will support us in monitoring this site. So as a useful observation, it may be worth talking to the Environment Agency about how you monitor to their standards. In terms of something for Lucas, very quickly, there's an organisation in the UK called UK WIN, UK Without Incinerators, and they are looking for monitoring systems. What we're actually proposing to do is put these monitors up for 2 years prior to the operational cycle of the incinerator, and we'll be the only organisation in the UK that has that amount of data prior to an incinerator becoming operational. So that's our objective here, and hence my interest. But I wanted to share the bit about the EA because I think that's really quite useful and important.
I agree, actually. Did you have a particular contact name at the EA?
Yes, but I need to speak to him first before I actually produce. But I will happily do that and then happily share that out. But we're very, very lucky because we are very well funded, and we're looking at actually buying 20 of the Airlie ones and creating our own network. But with the deal we've got with Airlie at the moment, we think is that we retain the data, and therefore working with some of the universities locally who will map this mathematically, we can create a really strong piece of academic data to support the impact of incinerators. And we think that that's not been done before.
Yeah, no, I think you're right. I think it is really, really important that prior to a development such as that you do try and get a baseline, because then you've got something to compare what happens afterwards with. Because it's no good just saying, oh, well, you know, we've got 200 more HGVs an hour, therefore the air pollution has gone up. Because the council will say something like, but we've got 2 roads now and it's spread between 2 roads or what have you, you know. So that baseline is really, really important.
I'm just responding to some of the chat that's coming up here now. Yes, we use Plume Potter, and I am actually elected member at Braintree District Council and got elected on this issue. I'm a Green Party member as well, so hopefully bringing the Green Party in with that. So hopefully, you know, all of these things we've done. If anybody wants to find our Facebook page, it's Parishes Against Incinerator. Please have a look. There's a lot of air quality data on there. There's a lot of our reports on there, and we had an air quality specialist who wrote our reports, and it's all on the Facebook page under the file section. Please feel free, and if you can't find it, let me know. I'm more than happily share it.
Super. And Caroline, would you mind putting in the chat the Community Planning Alliance email address so that Nick can share with us that contact name from the Environment Agency, and we can
I live just down the road from Rosie anyway, so
right, okay, so you'll know. Okay,
yeah, thanks a lot. I'll shut up now. Thank you.
Nick, thank you. So Stuart, you wanted to come back in?
Sorry, that was a legacy hand.
Oh, that was a legacy hand. No worries. Yeah. Okay. Are there any other questions in the chat then that we haven't picked up or need to pick up now? Have we managed to pick up most of them? Peter, did you want to jump in again?
Yeah. Can you hear me all right?
Yeah, you're very quiet, but no worries. Let's push on because it's we should be finished now.
Is that better?
Yeah.
Right. I actually was involved in monitoring around an incinerator up in the northwest of England. I'm not sure I can say which one. And we didn't actually find, even with the best of analyzers, we didn't actually manage to find any significant differences. It's a big subject. I don't want to get into it now, but if anybody's dealing with this and air quality around incinerators, just email me at askaboutair@outlook.com, please.
Okay, super. Thank you, Peter. Okay, well, listen, I'm conscious of the time. We are over a little bit, so we better draw to a close now. Loads of such interesting issues, and really want to thank the speakers for great presentations, very interesting, and so much to really think about, I think. So and what I would do is encourage you all to complete our survey on air quality monitoring in your local area, and whether you're contacting with your local authority, we'd be really keen to get a picture of what's going on around the country. So please do respond to that survey. We will be sharing information about the next event in this session, but I think we will be looking at some actions after this, because so many things to think about, and I think Peter, Graham and Mike, really great presentations. I think everybody probably enjoyed that as much as I did. So thank you everyone for taking the time and staying with us for an hour and a half. We do appreciate it, and as I say, do complete our survey, because that will help us a lot. Okay, well, I'm going to stop the recording now.